The morning I turned 62, I woke up to an empty house and a phone screen glowing on the kitchen counter. Not a card, not a cake, not even the smell of coffee someone else had started. Just a text message, 3 sentences long, from my wife of 9 years. We're staying at Derek's through the weekend. Your things are in the garage. Please don't be here when we get back. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the counter, walked to the window, and watched a neighbor's sprinkler arc slowly back and forth across a brown November lawn. I didn't shout. I didn't call her back. I just stood there, 62 years old, in a house I had bought with my own hands 23 years before she ever walked through the door, and I let the silence tell me everything it had been trying to say for a very long time. My name is Gerald, and this is the story of the quietest decision I ever made. I met my wife at a company retirement dinner. Not mine, a colleague's. She was seated 2 chairs down, laughing at something the man beside her said, and I remember thinking she had the kind of laugh that made a room feel warmer. She had been divorced for 4 years by then. She had a son, Caleb, who was 15. She was honest about both things on our very first conversation, and I respected that. I was 53. I had been a widower for 6 years. My own son, Marcus, was already grown and living in Portland. My house was clean and quiet and too large for one person, and I had convinced myself I preferred it that way. By our 3rd date, I knew I didn't. She was warm and funny, and she listened when I talked. Really listened, the way people do when they're genuinely interested and not just waiting for their turn to speak. We dated for 2 years before I asked her to marry me. She said yes before I finished the sentence. I want to be fair as I tell this story, because she was not always the person I am going to describe. In those first years, she was the woman I fell in love with. That is important to say. Caleb was 17 when we married. He was lanky and quiet and a little sullen in the way teenage boys often are, and I didn't take it personally. I had raised a son. I understood that at 17, the last thing you want is your mother's new husband trying to be your friend. So I gave him space. I was present without being pushy. I came to his basketball games when I was invited. I stayed out of his room. When he needed help with his truck, I was in the driveway with a socket set without being asked twice. I thought we had reached a reasonable peace. What I didn't fully understand then was that Caleb's father, her ex-husband, a man named Derek, had never fully left the picture. He lived 40 minutes away. He called frequently. He was, by all outward appearances, involved, but involved in the way that created obligation without accountability. He would promise to take Caleb for a weekend and cancel at the last minute. He would tell Caleb he'd cover half the car insurance and then go silent for 3 months. He was the kind of absent that still managed to take up all the space in a room. My wife had a complicated relationship with Derek. I understood that. They had a child together. There would always be some degree of contact. I accepted that. What I didn't accept, at first, was how that contact slowly began to reshape everything inside our home. It started small. Derek would call with some issue. Caleb needed new tires. Derek was short that month. Could we cover it, and he'd pay us back? My wife would tell me about it with apologetic eyes, and I would say yes, because I didn't want to be the man who said no to something practical for her son. A few months later, same call, different reason. Caleb wanted to apply to a private college out of state. The application fees alone were several $100s. Derek thought it was a great idea. Derek did not offer to contribute to the fees. I paid them. Caleb got into the school. It was a good school, genuinely, and I was glad for him. But when the tuition conversation came, it arrived at our kitchen table the same way everything arrived, as a fact that had already been decided, needing only my signature on a check. My wife sat across from me with her hands folded and said, "Derek is going to help when he can." I asked what that meant in dollar terms. She looked uncomfortable and said she wasn't sure yet. Derek's contribution over 4 years of college totaled $1,100. I know that number exactly because I wrote down every figure in a small notebook I kept in my desk drawer. Not out of resentment, at least not at first, but because I'm a methodical person and I like to understand what I'm doing with money. I had spent decades as a civil engineer. Numbers were how I understood the world. Caleb graduated. I sat in the bleachers in the June heat and watched him walk across the stage, and when my wife squeezed my hand, I felt something real. Whatever else was complicated, that part was genuine. What happened after was less so. By the time Caleb was 24, he had moved back home. Not temporarily, the way young people sometimes do between jobs or apartments. He moved back in the way someone moves into a place they consider theirs by right. His old room became his room again, and then the room beside it became a home office, and then his friends started appearing on Friday evenings without advance notice, and the living room television developed a schedule that had nothing to do with me. I raised this with my wife, calmly, clearly, the way I raise everything. She said I needed to be patient. Caleb was getting back on his feet. I asked what the timeline looked like. She said she didn't want to pressure him. I said I wasn't asking her to pressure him. I was asking what we were working toward. She said I was being rigid. That word, rigid, began appearing more frequently after that. If I asked about finances, I was rigid. If I pointed out that Caleb had left the garage door open 3 nights in a row, I was rigid. If I mentioned that I had come home to find Derek sitting in my living room drinking my coffee while my wife made him lunch, I was told, and I want to be precise here, that I was being insecure and rigid, and that Derek was part of Caleb's life and therefore part of the family. I sat with that for a long time. Derek was part of the family. The man who had paid $1,100 over 4 years toward his son's education while I paid the rest. The man who had canceled on Caleb more times than I could count, who had borrowed money from my wife twice during our marriage and repaid none of it, who had once, when he thought I was out of earshot, referred to me as the old engineer, in a tone that was not complimentary. Part of the family. I kept writing in my notebook. The year Caleb turned 26, a position opened up at his old employer, a firm he'd left under circumstances that were described to me only in the vaguest terms. He asked my wife if I could make a call. I had a contact there, a man I'd worked alongside on a city infrastructure project years before. My wife came to me with the same folded hands, the same apologetic eyes. I made the call. Caleb got the interview. He did not get the job, but the contact remembered my name warmly, and that apparently mattered for something because 2 months later, Caleb was hired in a different role at the same firm. He did not thank me. Not directly, not indirectly, not in any form I was ever made aware of. My wife thanked me on his behalf. I wrote that down too. I want to be honest about something. I'm not telling this story to portray myself as a saint. I made mistakes in those years. I went quiet when I should have spoken. I swallowed things that should have been said out loud. I told myself I was being patient when sometimes I was simply being avoidant. because confrontation in that house had a cost I didn't always feel prepared to pay. Every time I raised something clearly and directly, I was rigid. Every time I stayed quiet, I was safe. I learned the wrong lesson from that. And I learned it slowly over years. And by the time I understood what it had cost me, the bill was already very large. The summer before my 62nd birthday, something shifted. Derek had been spending more time at the house. Caleb had started going to his father's place on weekends, which I had no objection to. What I had more difficulty with was that Derek had begun coming here instead. He would arrive on Saturday mornings, and my wife would make a full breakfast, the kind she no longer made for me on weekday mornings because she said she wasn't really a morning person anymore. He would sit at my kitchen table for 2-3 hours. Once I came downstairs at 9 in the morning and found him already there, apparently having arrived before I was awake. I asked my wife that evening, quietly, if she could tell me what was happening. She said nothing was happening. She said Derek was lonely and Caleb needed his father present, and this was just what co-parenting looked like when everyone was mature about it. Caleb was 26 years old. The co-parenting framing had ceased to make structural sense to me. I said that. She said I was jealous and rigid. I stopped arguing. I went to my desk and I opened my notebook and I did something I had never done before. I added up every column I had kept for 9 years. Mortgage contributions, tuition, car payments I'd covered, repairs, the loan to Derek that was never repaid, the second loan, Caleb's moving costs when he left the first time, and his moving costs when he came back. Groceries for a household that now functioned on my income while my wife had reduced her working hours 2 years prior to, as she put it, focus on herself. The number I arrived at was significant. I looked at it for a long time. Then I closed the notebook and put it in my briefcase, and I went to bed. I didn't sleep. For the next 2 months, I did something I had never done during the marriage. I paid attention without reacting. I watched and I listened and I kept notes, not out of malice, but because I was finally admitting to myself that I needed to understand the situation clearly before I decided what to do about it. I called Marcus in Portland and talked to him for 2 hours one night, the longest conversation we'd had in years. I called my attorney, a woman I'd used for property matters for a decade, and I had a preliminary conversation just to understand my position. My attorney reminded me of something I already knew but had not fully centered in my thinking. The house was mine. It had been mine since I was 39 years old. My wife's name was not on the deed. We had discussed adding it when we married, and she had agreed, and then the paperwork had simply never been completed, and I had let it drift because everything was fine and there was no urgency. My attorney suggested, gently, that I might want to keep it that way for now. I thanked her and said I'd be in touch. The text message arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, my birthday, while I was still in my bathrobe. We're staying at Derek's through the weekend. Your things are in the garage. Please don't be here when we get back. I stood at the window with the sprinkler arcing across the neighbor's lawn, and I understood that my wife had just handed me something she didn't realize she was handing me. She had made the decision for me, clearly and in writing, on a day she apparently had not thought through very carefully. I went upstairs. I showered and dressed. I made coffee, my own coffee, in my own kitchen, and I drank it standing at the counter. Then I called my attorney. She picked up on the second ring and I told her what had happened. She asked if I was ready to move forward. I said yes, She said she'd have paperwork started by end of day. I said that sounded right. Then I thanked her and hung up. I sat down and I made a list, the way I make lists for everything, because I am methodical and numbers are how I understand the world. I contacted my bank and separated the joint account, moving my direct deposit and the funds I had contributed over the prior months into a personal account I had opened quietly 6 weeks before, on the advice of my attorney, and without any intent to deceive, simply to be prepared. I contacted the mortgage servicer. The mortgage was in my name alone. I called the insurance provider. I called the utility companies. Then I opened a browser and I looked at the house. My house. 23 years of my life in it before she ever arrived, and 9 years with her in it. And in all of that time, the walls had not changed and the floors had not changed, and the big window in the den that looked out over the backyard oak tree had not changed. I had planted that tree the year I moved in. It was 40 feet tall now. I did not move my things into the garage. I moved her things into the garage. Carefully, respectfully, everything folded and boxed, nothing broken. I am not that kind of person. Then I sat in my armchair in my den with a book I hadn't had the quiet to read in months, and I read it, and outside the oak tree held its last few leaves against a gray November sky, and the house was still in a way it hadn't been in a long time. They came back on Sunday afternoon. I heard the car in the driveway, and then the sound of the front door, and then silence. I was in the kitchen. I heard my wife's footsteps moving through the house, and then stopping, and then the sound of Caleb's voice saying something I couldn't make out, and then her voice, higher than usual. She appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at me for a moment without speaking. I said, "Good afternoon." She asked what I had done. I said I had done exactly what she asked. I told her I had given her request careful consideration, and I had responded accordingly. She asked what that meant. I told her that as of that morning, the joint account no longer existed. I told her that the utilities were in my name and would remain in my name, serviced by my bank account, which was also now solely in my name. I told her that the mortgage, which had always been solely in my name, would continue to be paid by me for now, while the legal process moved forward. I told her I had spoken with an attorney. She stared at me. I told her that the garage held her belongings and Caleb's belongings, packed with care, and that I had left a message with Derek's number, which I had found in her phone's recent calls while she was away, letting him know that if he had space, now would be a reasonable time for it. I want to be honest. I did not say this with anger. I said it the way I say most things, evenly, because I'm 62 years old, and I have learned that anger costs more than it delivers, and because the truth was I was not angry. I had moved through anger months ago and come out somewhere else. Somewhere quiet and a little sad, and also, underneath that, something that felt almost like solid ground. Caleb appeared in the doorway behind her. He was 26 years old, and he was looking at me the way he had never quite looked at me before. Not with entitlement, not with the comfortable assumption that I would absorb whatever was needed, but with something more uncertain. He asked if I was serious. I said I was. He asked what they were supposed to do. I said that was a reasonable question and I hoped he would give it serious thought. I said that he was 26 and employed, and that the firm where he worked had a health plan and likely had resources, and that his father had a home 40 minutes away that he was apparently spending a great deal of time at regardless, and that all of those were good starting points. My wife said I was punishing her. I said I didn't see it that way. I said she had sent me a message on my birthday asking me to leave my own home, and I had chosen not to leave. And I had also chosen to take her at her word that she wanted a different arrangement, and I was honoring that. She said she hadn't meant it like that. I said I understood, but I said that I had meant it the way I was saying it now, and that I thought we had both known for some time that we had arrived somewhere neither of us had intended when we started, and that the kindest thing at this point was to be clear. She asked if we could talk about it. I said that my attorney would be in touch with her by Wednesday. Then I picked up my book from the counter where I had set it when I heard the car, and I went back to the den, and I sat in my armchair, and I looked out at the oak tree, and I let the silence do what silence does when you finally stop filling it with things that were never really the point. Marcus called me that evening. Someone had apparently told him what happened, though I still don't know exactly how the information traveled. He asked if I was all right. I said I was better than I had been in a while. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad, I wish you'd said something sooner." I told him I wish that too. I told him that being patient and being passive can look identical from the outside, and sometimes from the inside as well, and that learning the difference between them had taken me longer than it should have. He said he was coming to visit in December. I said I would have the guest room ready. After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the quiet house. The heat came on with its low hum. The oak tree was dark against the evening sky. My notebook was on the desk. All those columns, all those years of careful record-keeping that I had kept because numbers were how I understood things, and because some part of me had known, even when I didn't want to acknowledge it, that I was going to need to understand this particular situation very clearly one day. I picked up the notebook and I held it for a moment. Then I put it back in the desk drawer. I didn't need it anymore. The math had resolved itself. Sometimes that is how things end, not with a confrontation or a declaration, but with a text message on a Tuesday morning that hands a man the clarity he had been too patient for too long to take for himself. I went to the kitchen and cooked dinner. A real dinner, the kind I hadn't made in months because evenings in that house had become something to be navigated rather than enjoyed. I put on the radio and I cooked slowly and I ate at my own table, looking out at my own backyard, and the oak tree held its shape in the dark, and it was, for the first time in a long time, a quiet I had chosen rather than one I had simply endured. There is something I want to say to anyone who recognizes this story, or some piece of it. There is a particular kind of slow erosion that happens when you keep saying yes, because no feels too costly. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives in small adjustments, a tone you start using, a room in your own house you begin to avoid, a notebook you keep in a desk drawer because you need to track what is yours, so you don't lose sight of it entirely. By the time you notice it clearly, the erosion has been going on for years. I am not angry at my wife. I am not even angry at Caleb. People will take what is offered without examining the cost to the person offering it, especially when nothing is ever said directly. That is not cruelty. It is just human. But I had a choice. I had always had a choice. And 62 years old, standing at my own kitchen window on my birthday with a 3-sentence text message on a phone screen, I finally made it. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. That, it turns out, was always enough.